A woman in a white dress drops underwater, submerged in its depths. Meanwhile, two young girls spend time together near a waterfall. They each wear long blue clothing, reminiscent of the way back when times. They run off, returning to their small colony. They walk along a craggy mountain full of bush and pine. They live an idyllic lifestyle, drying clothes under the sun, farming, raising animals, and playing in the fields. In this settlement, different women do household chores and sing songs of halcyon wonder. They raise goose and sheep, cut their own log, and butcher their own meat. Around 20 women live in the settlement, living in the middle of nowhere. Women classify according to the color of their robes, blue and red. Women in blue classify as daughters, while women in red classify as wives. A man in black lives as the sole male in the settlement, who acts as the provider and leader of the settlement. As everyone enjoys their meal, the bearded man, the shepherd, thanks the wives and daughters for their work. He gives every wife a tap on the shoulder until he reaches one of them. The shepherd asks the chosen wife if they accept his grace, then follows him into a back room. Later that night, the daughters recite a prayer to the shepherd. As the women sleep for the night, one stays awake, looking at the ceiling. The next day, the shepherd and the wife picked from the previous night wake up, the latter kissing her on the forehead. She thanks him for consummating their marriage. A few moments later, another wife comes out, showing that she's pregnant. Meanwhile, one of the daughters shyly looks from afar, running away after a few seconds. The shepherd tells his stories in an enclosure protected by spun wool in the morning. The shepherd talks about religious experiences, asking everyone if they have cleansed themselves of the rot of the outside world. Here, all daughters answer in unison, wearing their white dresses. Among the girls, everyone wears their braids cleanly and in order, except for a blue-eyed girl in the back named Selah. The shepherd reminds everyone how he took everyone in, with the story ending with a sacrificial lamb, with its blood drained out. The shepherd dips his fingers in blood, which prompts the women to start their prayers, encircling him. He rubs the blood on Selah and a few others' cheeks, blessing them during the event. Their zealotry results in the women crying in euphoria. Later on, Selah and Tamar stand in the middle of the forest, with weaves of spun wool around the trees. Selah asks Tamar to go to Maria and help her, giving the former enough time to spend with the shepherd. As the two walk, the shepherd tries to give Selah some slack, teasing her about how bored she looks when he gives a sermon. He praises her, reckoning how beautiful she is, playing with her loose hair. She asks the story of when he first saw her mother, only for him to brush this off. He continues to play with her hair while she keeps asking about the story, showing no interest in what he does, but the shepherd continues to dismiss her questions. Meanwhile, one of the wives talks about her experiences with the shepherd. They tell how time with him is healing, how he showers her with praise and acceptance, many of which savor the only physical connection they have with the only male in their settlement. However, Selah makes her jealousy apparent, arguing how the wife just came in. She agitates her fellow sisters and wives, back-talking to them. One of the senior wives comes in, separating Selah from the others. Selah goes deep into the forest, looking at a dead bird slowly consumed by maggots. As she walks further, she happens upon a small hut. She opens the door, going inside the dark cabin, revealing another woman tucked inside. A woman comes out of the darkness, calling Selah a stupid child. The woman, named Esther, berates her, reminding her that the shepherd won't be so sweet once she comes of age. The older woman gives her grief, only for Selah to feel more annoyed than ever. She tries to hide her annoyance by kicking rocks near the pond, which she unsuccessfully does. Later that night, the women play in bed until one of the wives reminds everyone of the curfew. One of the younger ones asks for a story, only to remind her that only the shepherd is allowed to tell stories to the flock. This also reveals that the mothers and daughters sleep separately at night, with other daughters taking responsibility for their other sisters. Selah watches over the other daughters as they sleep. She looks out the window, seeing shadows moving about. In the dark of night, she sees one of the wives go to shepherd's house. The shepherd and the wife also look out the window, seeing Selah gazing. The shepherd puts 2 fingers inside the wife's mouth, seducing Selah. The next day, Selah contemplates in silence, jealous of the other wives and the privileges they get. Later on, we see some of the wives bathe the shepherd, telling him that lambs will be coming soon. Meanwhile, other wives clean Selah, reminding her that she's too young for the responsibility of helping sheep give birth. Later, Selah sits atop a hill, overlooking the mountains around. She falls asleep as she oversees the lamb, waking up to the lovely, warm sunlight. She continues to sleep atop the hill, dozing the day away. She wakes up to see one of the sheep sad, revealing a ewe with neither skin nor wool, malnourished and ready to die. She also discovers blood on her legs as she looks at the lamb, signifying that she has come of age. Selah screams in horror, not knowing what to do with herself. Later that night, she still sees blood dripping from her groin, screaming angrily at how unclean she is. One of her sisters checks up on her as she looks out the window, revealing that a wild dog ate the lamb in the afternoon, leading her to euthanize the animal. The shepherd forgave her, but she questioned herself and how she behaved. Later on, she walks the woods again, seeing a ram nearby. She goes on all fours, trying to look at the ram. From afar, she sees the shepherd looking on. She continues about her day, and later that night, she gazes out the window, seeing the police talking to the shepherd. The police go away, but the shepherd sees Selah awake. The next day, the shepherd congregates with everyone, telling them that the entire settlement is being evicted from their locale. The shepherd passes out, with everyone checking up on him except Selah, who looks on before she closes the gap. As the shepherd wakes up, he assures everyone that they will find a new home, giving them hope while they carry him up. He reassures Selah that they would have to move, reminding her that she is favored due to her faith. Later, they prepare for their move, singing songs while they trek the treacherous birch woods. The settlement travels with their sheep, sleeping in tents throughout the journey. The shepherd continues to lead them and the animals around. As they share a meal around the campfire, he smiles with contentment, knowing he still has complete control of his settlement. Later that night, Selah wakes up again, looking at the shepherd as he holds onto a sacrificial lamb and a knife. She dreams about 3 women drowning underwater, a burnt lamb, and herself in a white gown, bloodied by her period. As they trek the mountains, they find a small, dilapidated home. The house is grimy, with broken windows, dirty floors, and primarily damaged walls. Selah looks at the frame on the wall, missing the mountains where she grew up. Selah asks why can't they settle there for the night, only for the shepherd to remind them that it was a broken place. He berates them for even coming inside, dismissing the home as unfit for their needs. They continue to trek through the night, sleeping outside the house they found. Later that night, the women do their chores and sing. Selah stays by the fire, looking at the shepherd's tent. She goes to the home once again, defying his orders, looking at the image on the wall, mystified by the land's beauty. Suddenly, one of the wives shows up to her, breathing deeply as she shows hand marks on her neck, surprising Selah. Later on, Selah throws up near a tree, only for a ram to look at her again. Eventually, one of the daughters sees her have her period, segregating her from the rest of the pack with Esther. As they rest, the wives and daughters argue. The wives are jealous of the attention the younger ones get, while the daughters gloat their youth to their faces. Selah queries Esther on why she's segregated in a separate camp, the latter noting that her vanity led to her isolation. The shepherd calls her a broken thing, talking about Selah's mother. She tells Selah that Esther and her mother were among the first given grace, but she somehow felt the attention burnt her. The young girl is indignant about Esther's lack of faith, with the latter admitting that she was jealous of Selah's mother before. Selah discovers that her mother did not die of childbirth. Instead, she died from her infection after he refused to bring her to the hospital. Meanwhile, a couple is inside the car, driving it across the plains, which seems to be the shepherd and a young Selah. At the same time, Selah sees the vehicle pass her by but ignores it. She somehow sheds a tear, sad and cold, about what she learned from Esther. Later that night, Selah remains indignant of the shepherd, disillusioned, and unhappily looks at one of the wives. Selah has more thoughts of rebellion against the shepherd. Meanwhile, the latter spends the night with Esther, enjoying the feeling of being touched after so many years. Later on, Selah gets to return with the leading group of sisters, many asking her what happened and what the cursed wife told her. Everyone dismisses Esther, continuing to walk across treacherous lands with their sheep. Selah improves her pace, walking alongside the shepherd. He apologizes to her, calling Esther a broken thing, while the pregnant wife starts her labor contractions in the middle of nowhere. As she goes into labor, the others try to help her, giving birth in the middle of nowhere. The younger ones hear her laborious screams, many of them terrified at the anguish they hear of childbirth. Later on, the child is properly born, but the wife dies from childbirth complications. Esther questions Shepherd's capabilities, calling him by his real name, Michael. Esther remains dissatisfied, unhappy with the level of influence he still has on everyone. Later that night, Selah still looks angry, overlooking the searing flames of the funeral pyre. Later, the journey continues for the cult, but Esther decides not to go with them. Selah questions her, only for the latter to tell her that the shepherd wanted the baby burnt with its mother because it's a boy. Everyone walks through a cleared-out forest, with Tamar asking if they are closer to their destination. As she gives her suggestions, the shepherd asks her to lead, prompting her to walk in her chosen direction. He bullies Tamar, beating her and injuring her shoulder in the process. He drags her across the ground, abusing her and excluding the young lady. Everyone, tired and dejected, gets more depressed by the sight of his abuse, while Selah starts to feel heartened by the situation. She keeps a stiff upper lip while the shepherd himself starts to lose control. The girls are tired and battered from the journey, but Selah goes to Tamar, indignant about her good friend's abuse. The shepherd suddenly stops their journey, reaching a small lake nearby. Everyone looks on the cliffside, many happy with the beauty of the place they traveled to, while others are simply satisfied that the journey has ended. The shepherd performs baptism for everyone, lunging them into the lake's waters, with Selah as the last of the baptized. The shepherd gives particular care to Selah, dunking her in the water for longer than the others. This lets her see other bodies in the lake, floating around in their death. Selah screams once again, remembering all the times she did, all iterations. Every iteration, even the one in the vehicle. Selah breathes in once again, fully blessed by the shepherd. The girls sit around the campfire, eating in silence, as the old wives will be reborn the next day. Selah still finds it hard to sleep, seeing the shadow of the shepherd beckoning out to her. Tamar asks her not to go, but Selah accedes, coming to the shepherd's tent. She comes in, seeing his dark shadow. He asks her to unbraid her hair and sit beside him. She rests near him, with the shepherd touching her everywhere. Her hair, her forehead, his kisses run on her neck. The shepherd starts to put his fingers in her mouth to prevent her from making a sound. As he does what he wants with her, Selah gasps for air. She feels unhappy and violated, touching the blood that came from her first time and putting it on her cheek. The next day, all the women in the flock attack the shepherd, ganging up on him. They wake up from his control over them, unhappy with the recent abuse they received in his hands. They bite off his ears and disable him, with Selah performing the killing blow with a rock smashed on his head. Later on, Selah tries to tell a story, only for the young one to tell her that only the shepherd can tell a story. She ignores this, telling the story of Esther and how she emancipated her from the clutches of the shepherd. As Selah looks out the window, she sees the ram and the group of sheep. They wonder where the wives went, and as they search around, they see the shepherd sitting near the sands of the lake. Here, they learn that he killed all the wives, putting their corpses in nearby waters. They discover that the previous batch of wives had to die for the sisters to become the wives. The shepherd beckons Selah, and as she comes closer, she rejects him, leading the revolt. Later on, we see how the shepherd murdered all the original wives, drowning them in the lake's waters. This led to the girls killing the shepherd. Later on, a white police car goes to the lake, with an older policeman going out to his partner. They overlook the lake that has dried up, seeing several corpses of dead women along the waters. The officers move on, only to see the beaten, damaged corpse of the shepherd, with the ram's horns over his head. The remaining girls go back to the original settlement to the waterfall that Esther visits at night. Selah holds the sheep, signifying her new leadership over the flock.